So my name is Eric Raskin, and I have been in the boxing media since 1997. My first job right out of college was as managing editor of The Ring magazine. So I worked there full time for about 7.5 years, pretty much throughout my 20s, before eventually leaving to take a job in gambling journalism. Specifically, I became the editor of a then launching brand new poker magazine right in the height of the poker boom in 2005 when it was going nuts. And so ever since then, I've continued to cover boxing on the side as a freelancer. I've written for ESPN, Grantland.com, HBO's website. Um, I'm currently recently started writing for Boxing Scene and Pro Box. And since 2011, so since 2009, I've also hosted boxing podcasts. So I've had several throughout the years, but most notably, for 5 years, Kieran Mulvaney and I co-hosted HBO's boxing podcast, and then for 5 years we co-hosted Showtime's boxing podcast. So, um, yeah, that's pretty much my background as it pertains to boxing.
And shall we start from the very start, from when you left college? Why boxing? What sort of brought you onto boxing? You could have gone into any sports. You could have even gone into anything you want. Why boxing specifically?
So it's interesting. I was not a boxing fan at the time. I wasn't anti-boxing. It was not a sport that I ever particularly followed. I had decided midway through college that even though I decided to major in mathematical economics, despite that, I realized I didn't really want a career in that. And my sophomore, junior years of college, I started getting more into writing for the weekly newspaper in school. My sophomore year, I did some sports writing. My junior year, I was sports editor, and my senior year, I was managing editor of the weekly paper, and wasn't going to change my major. So I still stuck with mathematical economics, but knew I wanted to find a job in sports writing. That was where my passion lied. So got out of college, moved back home with my parents and looking for jobs. And that summer, after I came home from college, my father actually found he was looking for jobs for me harder than I was. He was in a hurry to get me working. He found a job in the paper that it didn't specify that it was Ring Magazine. I didn't know that yet. It just said, something to the effect of Boxing Magazine located. I'm from Philadelphia area, the suburbs outside Philadelphia, and the Ring magazine was at that point headquartered in a town called Fort Washington, Pennsylvania, about 15 minutes from where my parents lived. So saw an ad in the paper for a sports editor for a boxing magazine. Went and interviewed for it, and it turned out it's the same company that produces, or at the time produced, um, a whole bunch of pro wrestling magazines. And I grew up a huge pro wrestling fan and read all their magazines and knew all the people on the editorial staff from reading those magazines. So I went in to interview with them. Um, what had happened was the Ring magazine had three editors, and two of them were leaving at once. It was just a strange coincidence where suddenly they desperately needed to bring someone in. Actually, ended up making two hires, but initially just getting someone in the door. And so knowledge of boxing was not essential. They were looking to hire someone who could write and edit, and you can learn boxing on the job. So I had a good interview. They offered me the job, and I took it within the back of my mind, thinking, I don't know if I like boxing. I don't know if I care, but I'll hang around here, and maybe they'll move me into the pro wrestling department at some point. That's where I really want to be. So I started the job, and about a month in, I went to my first live fight. It was in Atlantic City. The main event was Lennox Lewis's first round knockout of Andrew Galata, and the co-feature bout was Arturo Gatti versus Gabe Ruelas, and it was the fight of the year. And from that moment I was hooked. And so that's really the night I became a boxing fan and got really passionate about the job and ended up staying there 7 years. So yeah, started it with no background in boxing and just quickly developed a passion for it.
Yeah, well, that is a very like cool, quite a cool story. That I know Kieran had the same sort of thing in terms of not starting in boxing and trying to push over to boxing after doing a lot of stuff. So it seems like you've had similar paths. Just getting back to your college days, you said that you did mathematical economics, which is probably where the sports gambling side of things maybe makes a play as well. But you were writing in college, and that's not a thing that we have over here in the UK.
Mm.
Sort of like a weekly paper doesn't really exist at our universities. What really put you towards writing, and what interests you in the sports business and specifically in the sports writing?
So I mean, I've been a sports fan for about as long as I can remember. It was probably about 6 years old that I first started. I happened to be wearing a Philadelphia Phillies baseball hat. That's just coincidence, but that was my first team. I started watching baseball when I was 6, and quickly got really into baseball and really into all of the statistics and opening up the paper every morning and seeing all the box scores and all that stuff. So I'd always liked sports. I never really thought about making a career out of it. In college, so I went to Brown University, which is in Rhode Island, and there's a daily newspaper that's student run, and there's also a weekly paper that's a little more like a magazine. And a friend of mine from freshman year, our sophomore year, he became sports editor of the weekly paper, the College Hill Independent. And he just asked me if I would want to write an article or two, or on occasion chip in, whatever. And the first article I wrote happened to actually be about pro wrestling, which was a very random thing to cover in the college paper, but it got a nice response. And so I kept writing here and there for them. So it was really at the end of my sophomore year, my friend who was the sports editor uh, didn't want to be sports editor anymore our junior year and asked if I'd be interested in replacing him. And so I decided to give that a shot. And that was really where I think I began to realize that this was something that I had an aptitude for and that I was really into. Particularly that there was a I was basically writing, an article every week in addition to editing the section. And the particular moment that like sort of turned a light on that maybe this could be something to pursue was there was a star baseball player at the time. This was in 1995, 96, a star baseball player named Roberto Alomar, who it became a big controversy when he was controversially called out on strikes in a big game and got really angry and was jawing at the umpire and ended up spitting in the umpire's face. And I wrote a defense of him spitting on the umpire, which was obviously not the natural take, but it was honestly how I felt that if the choice was between winding up and decking the umpire versus spitting on him, he took the relatively nonviolent route. And I basically wrote a defense of it, and a bunch of people it that way, but you made a great case, and I think you brought me around to your side, and so that was sort of the moment where I realized, oh, maybe I've got an aptitude for this sports writing thing if I was able to communicate that angle well. And so yeah, that's really the moment where I started to seriously consider getting into a career in sports journalism.
That's really cool because we don't really have over here much of a sort of we don't have that sense of pride when we go to university, especially to even have a paper like that, or even if we did, and we have a website through my course, but not the whole university wouldn't even know about it. It would just be our course. So we wouldn't even be like, there wouldn't be people reading it around on campus or anything. But it's quite cool. It's the thing that I'm quite jealous of in America is that sort of sense of pride, and the sense of pride in your universities and your colleges. especially when you can sort of do that. I think it opens up a lot more doors for journalists. We don't really get an option over here to express our work
Hmm.
with an actual audience. It's more just do it on your own time and then in your own sort of areas.
Right. Although I guess maybe it's a little different now also with internet publishing, that you can still, if you want to write, you can write,
Yeah.
and it can potentially find an audience. Whereas when I was in college, if there was no paper, then there was no way that anyone was ever going to read anything I wrote.
But so just getting back into sort of boxing and that style, how do you sort of prepare for an interview when you go to do one, or to prepare for fights even when you were in doing the Ring magazine stuff?
Mhm.
What sort of process would you go through? Is it the same for majority of things, or is it different per whatever you're specifically writing for?
So with boxing for me, there's a comfort level having been doing it so long, and even fairly early on, once I'd been doing it for a little while. Um, my preparation is not terribly intense, because I feel comfort in the subject matter. If I'm going to interview someone totally unrelated to anything I've ever covered before, then I'm going to have to put a lot more time into research and prep. But in general, if I'm interviewing a boxer, I'm just spending a few minutes thinking about what sort of angles I'm going to want to pursue. And I always write my questions out in advance. There are some people who can maybe just jot down a couple of notes and kind of wing it. That's not me. I like to have fully crafted questions ready to go and then figure out, based on where the interview is heading, which ones I'll tweak, which ones I'll use, which ones I'll just ditch along the way. But that's my process for an interview, is just sketching out a whole list of questions in advance, knowing where I may want to steer things. And as far as actually going to a fight to cover a fight, um, that's a little different in that you can't really prepare too much and anticipate too much. You want to have familiarity with the fighters and the storylines coming in, but for the most part, you're going to be reacting to whatever happens in the ring. So I don't, if I'm if I were assigned tomorrow to go cover a fight card this Saturday, um, I would, take 2 minutes to look at who all the names on the card are and see who, if there's anyone I want to particularly study up on. But for the most part, I'm just rolling in there with my computer and taking notes as the fights go on and figuring out what my angles are going to be based on what happens in front of me.
Um, and then more down the interview route, who do you have a particular favorite person that you interviewed, or a particular moment from an interview that sort of sticks with you?
It's a good question. I tend to flash back to some of the earlier ones I did, just because I was um there's sort of there it just had more of an impact on me when I'm in my early to mid 20s still, and I'm interviewing some legend of boxing. So two of the early ones that really stand out were going to Joe Frazier's gym in Philadelphia and sitting down for about 45 minutes with Joe Frazier and interviewing him. And along similar lines, it was probably around the same time. This was probably 1998, 1999. I met up in New York with Jake LaMotta and interviewed him. So those are like two Hall of Fame absolute legends whose names I was well familiar with before I became a boxing fan. At least I knew who Joe Frazier and Jake LaMotta were. And they were just, really eye-opening interviews to talk to these legends who thankfully were still mentally with it enough to have interesting things to say. Although I do remember Jake LaMotta, who was probably in his late 70s, maybe 80 or so at the time. I remember that he would go on autopilot from time to time. There were certain answers to questions that you could tell were the same answers he'd given 100 times before. But I mean, for the most part, both of those guys were totally lucid, and it was just kind of a crazy thing, almost kind of surreal. Step out of your body and look at the fact that here I am, this 23-year-old kid or whatever, and I'm sitting across the room from Joe Frazier, having a conversation with him, that sort of thing. But there have definitely been other boxers through over the years that I've really found interesting to interview. I mean, Bernard Hopkins is at once a fascinating interview every time and a challenge every time. You ask one question, and before you know it, he's spent 30 minutes answering it, and you haven't had a chance to ask your second question yet. There are certain challenges in there, but he always has fascinating things to say. I'm trying to think of some other ones. I in the last few years, where Kieran and I, for the podcast, were interviewing a lot of young boxers, up and coming boxers who would be fighting on Showtime. I feel like we were just struck all the time with um, how just how pleasant and likable so many of them came off, and it definitely it flies in the face of any stereotypes that people who don't know much about boxers may have, to assume they're all like street thugs or whatever. That in fact they're all, the great majority are really nice, charming guys who, if you sit down with them for a 15-minute interview, you'd be blown away with how little ego they seem to have and how respectful they are, and that really stood out as I've gotten a little older. A guy in my 40s interviewing these guys in their 20s, you sort of notice you come at it from a different perspective.
And on that note, how is it hosting the podcast with Kieran? And it's been going on for so long now. How is it? Like, how is it to be able to talk about a sport that you now have fallen a little bit in love with, at the very least? And how is it hosting that podcast?
It's fun. We have a good time doing it. What I've said as I've made my way through different mediums, covering boxing or covering anything, is basically the harder it is to do, the less money you make for it. Which is, in other words, writing is by far more difficult than podcasting or radio. It takes more time, more effort, and it pays less. You step up podcasting, and just in terms of like the per hour time put into it, pays more than writing and is easier to do than writing. And then the ultimate is get on TV, where they pay you the most to do the least. That's it's odd that it works that way, but that is how it works. But so yeah, relative to writing, podcasting is a lot less work, a lot less prep. You don't have to worry about whether every single word is the perfect word, because the audience understands that you're speaking extemporaneously. And whereas if I'm writing something, I'm going to slave over every word and make sure that I'm saying exactly what I want to say. So yeah, podcasting, especially the fact that we do it with the two of us plus guests, there's not the same pressure as of a solo activity. We're able to play off each other, you know, develop a certain chemistry and know how to banter together. And like particularly when we do for big fight weeks, we'll be on Radio Row with our podcasting setup, and various boxers, promoters, whatever, will be brought by and sit down and do interviews with us. For those, like, we don't script questions out in advance because we don't know who we're going to get. But for those, so I find it very helpful that it's a 2-on-1 interview, because I'll ask a question, they're giving an answer, I'm thinking about whether I have a follow-up question, maybe not, whatever. Then Kieran's going to ask the next question. I know that. So I have that time to like sit there and think about what's the next topic I may. Whereas if I'm going one-on-one and have no questions written down in advance, there's probably going to be an awkward pause at some point where I'm just like struggling to figure out what my next question should be. So that, just for me personally, I found that the 2-on-1 interview for a podcast really works well when you have a co-host you can trust that he's going to ask good questions and I'll ask good questions, and together we'll keep things moving along. But yeah, no, it's been a delight to do the podcast for so long with Kieran.
And then just back to a little bit towards your freelance work. You say you've had a lot of time to do or done little bits here and there. How is it freelancing? Because as a person that's gonna try and get into the industry over the next few years, freelancing seems quite a scary and unknown prospect. Is it that scary, or is it more? Is there more opportunities than you'd think?
There are a lot of opportunities, I think, but I get it depends what you're looking to get out of it and how much you're relying on it. I have always, with a few exceptions, I have for the most part always been in a situation where I've had a full-time job doing one thing and then some freelancing on the side. I do still rely on that income to an extent, but it's not my main source of income. Um, there have been a couple of brief moments where where I've considered, can I make it full time as a freelancer? Can I get enough gigs going to pay all the bills? And the answer would have been, when I was younger, single, only supporting myself, yes, probably. Once I had family to support, it's you need to really strike gold with some high paying freelance gigs in order to really make that work. So that's what I'd say. It's not too daunting or scary to be a freelancer if it's something you're doing on the side in addition to some sort of steady paying job. But if you're just trying to break in and make enough money as a freelancer for hire, um, it's challenging. There's a lot of opportunities out there, but until you've made a name for yourself, built a little bit of a reputation, you're almost certainly gonna be taking short money from anyone until you've sort of proven yourself and gotten some experience. So that's one of the big challenges is, if possible, to do freelancing on the side and not rely on it when you first get started. That's the safer route to go.
And on the same sort of career advice type thing, how is it easy or hard has it been contacting interviewees for pieces that you do in general? Because I know I've struggled partly in trying to get interviews for my major project, which is this is for. Um,
Right.
I managed to get quite a lot, to be fair, and it sort of builds up once you get a few contacts, and then you get one person through this person and all that.
Right.
But how is it trying to get them? And is there any advice that you'd have for me in terms of trying to get through to people?
Yeah, it can be a challenge depending on who they are, how high profile they are. Certainly, uh, if you as you develop contacts within a specific industry, like just within boxing, for example, I know all the PR people at this point. So as long as I can sort of track down which promotional company a fighter is with, and then so who's the PR person? Oh, it's this guy. Okay, I'll shoot him a quick email. Um, you can usually get who you want if you know who to contact and if the PR person knows you. It's obviously a little trickier when they don't know your name yet. So it definitely, the higher up the food chain you go with the how high profile an interview you're trying to land is, the tougher it's going to be. Oh, sorry. Let's you hear my dog going nuts in the background there. Someone must be at the door. So like for example, um Mike Tyson is somebody I have interviewed once. I've tried a few different times. I've gone through various PR people and to try to talk to him about this or that or whatever. Um, and I'm sure whoever's handling him is fielding dozens of requests on any given day from just about anyone in boxing or mainstream culture looking to talk to Mike Tyson. So it was like one instance where I was writing an oral history of his fight with Buster Douglas, where I knew I needed the Tyson interview or the article just doesn't work. And so I stayed on them, and it probably took like 6 weeks or so before they finally said, "Oh, okay, we can." I've bugged you 6 times with emails and phone calls, and you're finally going to make it happen. And he's available at this time, and here you go. Um, So sometimes like that, they're really tough. Or someone like even higher than that, like Sylvester Stallone. I wanted to interview once for an article where we would talk about the Rocky series as it pertained to some other things going on. It took a long time to track down the right PR person. I finally did, and they basically said, uh, "We'll ask Mr. Stallone, but I don't think he's going to be available for this." And you follow up a couple times, and you realize you're getting nowhere in that. But so yeah, as you go lower down, and it's just some random boxer who doesn't have a lot of mainstream cachet. You want to get an interview with him, you tell him what outlet you're with, and there's probably a PR person who's going to hook it up for you.
And then one final question from me is, what one piece of advice that would you give someone that wants to be in your position?
Um, I'm tempted to do the sort of cliched don't find something else to do. I don't quite want to go that far, but it is getting increasingly. It's been for a while, really, increasingly challenging to make a good career in media. I think that you see it every week. You see some new outlet that has announced layoffs, or more, someone buys up a company and decides, oh, we're going to pivot to more AI produced content and less human produced content. There are a lot of challenges like that are making the jobs more scarce than if it was the mid 90s and there was a newspaper in every town and the internet was not a threat to run them out of business yet. That was a very different time. Yeah, I mean, so I guess my uh advice would be um give it a go while you are in a position where you're not necessarily under financial pressure to pay big bills, and give it a go and see what sort of inroads you can make while you're young, with the understanding that a lot of people try and a lot of people pivot away from it, and it's a real challenge to make a living as a writer. But if you have the drive and you have the talent, um, usually that shines through, and you'll get there eventually. But I've had a couple of moments where I thought I was going to have to make a complete career change, and even did one time. I temporarily took a sales job because the magazine that I was editor for went out of business, and I didn't find a new job in the first few months, and my wife knew a guy who worked for a company that was hiring salespeople, and it was just like, all right, maybe my journalism dream is dead, and I got to make money. And so I tried something else for about 8 months and absolutely hated it, and eventually threw in the towel and said, and managed to get back into magazine editing instead. But yeah, be prepared for lots of challenges, and if your goal in life is to be rich, this is probably not the industry for you. But if your goal is to have a job that is fulfilling and you're motivated and you love writing, definitely try to give it a go. But just be prepared for the challenges involved.
Seems like the career that I want to go down. I could not care less about being rich, but if I have a job that I wake up every day to sit there, smile, and go into, I'm happy.
Yeah, that's good. Because, yeah, I mean, I know a lot of people in other industries who like dread their jobs. And that's one thing I can say is, aside from the sales job that I took briefly, there has not been another job where I've gotten up in the morning to edit a magazine, a website, to write for this, to podcast for that, or whatever, where I've dreaded having to do my job in the morning. So that is the upside, certainly.
That sounds good. Yeah, well, thank you very much for taking the time out of your day and sort of and speaking to me. Good luck on your new job.
Thank you. Thank you.
Have to
Yeah,
message me or give me an email about what the actual content is when it's allowed to be released.
Yeah, well, we just connected on LinkedIn, right? I think
Yeah,
so. Yeah, so on day one, next Monday when I start the job, I will put a post on LinkedIn announcing my new job. So you'll be able to see
yeah,
some
I'll keep an eye
details
on it.
there.
Yeah,
But
that'd be cool.
But yeah, no, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I hope this was helpful.
Yeah, yeah, really helpful. Thank you very much.
Great. All right. Good luck with the project.
Thank you very much.